It's high time to patch DNS Microsoft server.
So Ganesh, I hear there's a new vulnerability for Microsoft DNS.
The vulnerability was in the Microsoft Windows DNS server, which is basically Microsoft implementation of DNS in their Microsoft ecosystem. This has been actually found like a couple months ago by one of the researchers from, I believe, from Research Checkpoint Labs. And they informed Microsoft team, and they actually came up with a patch last week, like a few days ago, to address this issue. But what was the issue was, the issue seems to be relevant since the last 17 years in Windows DNS server. And it has the capability similar to WannaCry, which can be vulnerable in the sense, without any user interaction, it can propagate to vulnerable systems within the corporate environment as well as spanning to other networks. Actually, this has been given a CV number of 2020-1350, but the kicker here is CVS score of 10. For example, in comparison, when WannaCry came, Microsoft given it a CVS score of 8.5, whereas this vulnerability has given the full 10 out of 10 scoring. These researchers actually named this as a vulnerability SigRed. Why they name it SigRed is basically because SIG is basically it's an abbreviation for signature. When some sort of DNS request is happening, they found a certain way basically trick some sort of buffer overflow vulnerability when the signature is tricked out. That's why they call it the signature red. What happens is when this particular situation has been triggered off, it can grant into remote code execution and vulnerability, which in turn gives maybe some sort of malicious code execution on the DNS servers. What happens is because we all know DNS servers work in the context of system privileges, which in turn basically gives an attacker, any bad actor, complete control to that domain, whichever the domain the DNS server is actually responsible for. That makes it a very critical rating. I think that's one of the reasons Microsoft given it the highest rating possible. How is this affects? I think before the patch release, Microsoft given a workaround with the registry changes, which will basically minimize the effect of DNS servers. In this case, only the DNS servers are affected, not any DNS clients. Only the vulnerability was in the DNS servers. What happens is when a DNS response is larger than 64 kilobytes of the signature record, this particular vulnerability actually happens. That's why the name came as SigRed. What is this? I mean, in order to explain a little bit, I think we have to touch base for a very brief period of time about DNS truncation. DNS truncation is, we all know actually DNS uses the port 53 over UDP as well as TCP. Typically, the UDP requests have a limitation of 512 bytes of size in the request, whereas TCP component has 65,535 kilobytes, which is larger. But what happens is, but most of the times it's true unless it has like EDNS has been configured with the DNS server. In that case, the size of the packet could be 4096 bytes. But irrespective of, most of them have 512 bytes of limit. What happens is, in order to trigger this one, they will send a SigRed vulnerability on UDP port and with the truncation. Because the size of the packet is larger than 512 bytes, I think a DNS server responds with switch over to TCP to send the rest of the packet size. I think that's how this kind of this vulnerability triggers up. And when they sent larger than 535 bytes, they could able to crash some of the Microsoft Windows servers. What levels of DNS servers are vulnerable? it seems as per the Microsoft actually advisory, any versions from 2002 to 2003 to 2019 are vulnerable, and any of the afterwards are not vulnerable. But good thing is the patch is available at the end of last week, and whoever is running Microsoft DNS servers, they should do the patching as soon as possible to protect from themselves. But I have some indications of how this port, the theory of TCP port 53 is also used, can be detected from a common backbone graph. In this case, what I'm showing is number of scan sips, like a unique scan sips on port TCP 53 TCP in a given hour of time. Basically, X is the timeline and Y is how many scan sips are seen in particular hour. As you can see around in the last few days, I think right after 7:16, 7:15 time frame, there was a huge spike in jump in the number of scan sips on this port, which indicates basically what it means is basically around that time, the patch has been applied and also the information has been completely, I think, propagated all the parties in the internet. Maybe people are picking up this article and this about the SigRed, they were reading about it. Maybe some researchers as well as the bad actors, they started poking on this port. And that's the reason I think we saw about 3 to 4 times jump in the scans it's happening on this specific 53 TCP port.
I thought it was a really interesting article, and I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like there were a couple of ways they said if you can't patch this immediately, there's a few ways you can mitigate the risk. And I think one of them actually said blocking HTTP requests over port 53, because even though it's actually going to do the same type of thing as what we just showed with the TCP, that it's essentially going to overflow.
Yeah, that the researchers, I think they actually, like you said, Ken, they did like I think 3 to 4 variations of this attack, like you said, 53 over HTTP, as well as they also made some manipulations to the size of the packet request, and they came up with some solution. Some ways to basically trigger this one. Yeah, Microsoft advised to have some sort of registry key changes as well as limiting HTTP over TCP to some sort of actually restriction in the size of the packet or the request in this case. But those will be helpful if the people are still not able to apply the patch yet. I think those countermeasures can be put in place, but I think patches are available. I think it's prudent and advisable to do this patching as soon as possible because of the highest possible CVSS rating.
But yeah, I thought it was a very interesting point when you brought up the DNS truncation, since UDP protocol limits the size of the packet you can send. So I thought it was a pretty innovative way the researchers were able to use DNS truncation to send the larger payload size to trigger the heap overflow.
It's a good read to understand how they proceeded. Like Ken pointed out, they used HTTP as one of the vector to achieve the same buffer overflow. Not only that, like you said, truncation, they leveraged UDP for first, then actually they switched over to TCP because I think this is also one of the reasons I think they can reuse the sessions constantly, even if it's teared down, because UDP is connectionless. I think a TCP helped them out to basically achieve a much bigger impact.